On a humid October morning in 2017, inside a sprawling assembly plant in Elizabeth, South Australia, a man named Kim Carr stood near the end of a production line. He watched a red Holden Commodore roll slowly toward him. He was not the Prime Minister. He was not even, at that moment, a sitting minister. He was a senator from Victoria who had spent a decade fighting for this single industry. He had come north to witness its funeral. The car that rolled off the line that morning was the last Holden ever built on Australian soil. Workers signed its bonnet, some of them cried. Outside the gates, a country that had once built more than 400,000 cars a year was about to build none. The strangest part of the story is not that Australian car manufacturing died, it is how quickly it collapsed once it started. In just 6 years, between 2013 and 2017, 3 global automakers announced and executed the closure of every single factory they operated in the country. Ford, Holden, and Toyota all left. An entire industry more than a century old, employing tens of thousands of people across 2 states, was dismantled inside a single political term. The protagonist of this story is not really Holden, or Ford, or Toyota. It is the Australian car industry itself. An ambitious, deeply subsidized national project that began with a promise made in the years after the Second World War. The promise was simple. Australia would build its own cars, not assemble them from imported kits the way it had done since the 1920s, but design them, engineer them, and stamp them out of Australian steel for Australian roads. The man who turned that promise into policy was Ben Chifley, the Labour Prime Minister and former train driver from Bathurst. In November 1948, he stood on a stage at the Fisherman's Bend plant in Melbourne. He unveiled the first fully Australian-made car, the Holden 48-215. The crowd called it the FX. Chifley called it a beauty. Within a decade, 1 inch every 2 new cars sold in Australia would wear a Holden badge. What followed was a 30-year golden age, built on a single, unshakable assumption: the Australian government would protect the industry no matter the cost. Tariffs on imported cars rose to 45% by the 1970s. Foreign manufacturers who wanted to sell here were effectively forced to build here. Ford set up shop in Geelong. Chrysler built in Adelaide. Nissan, Mitsubishi, and Toyota all opened Australian plants. By 1970, the country had 8 car makers operating 13 factories. They employed more than 90,000 people directly. They supported an estimated 200,000 more through a vast network of component suppliers stretched across Melbourne, Adelaide, Sydney, and the industrial corridor through Geelong. The cars themselves became cultural artifacts. The Holden Kingswood, the Ford Falcon GT, the Valiant Charger. They were big rear-wheel drive 6-cylinder machines built for the wide straight roads of the Australian interior. They won at Bathurst. They appeared in films. They sat in the driveways of suburban quarter-acre blocks from Penrith to Salisbury, and they were, by global standards, completely uncompetitive on price. Australian-built cars cost roughly 30% more to manufacture than equivalent vehicles built in Japan or South Korea. This was a gap that tariffs and government subsidies papered over for decades. By the early 1980s, the cracks were beginning to show. The oil shocks had killed consumer appetite for the big 6-cylinder sedans that Australian factories were optimized to build. Japanese imports, smaller, cheaper, more fuel efficient, were taking market share even with the tariff wall. The Hawke Labour government, elected in 1983, looked at the economics and decided the wall could not stand forever. Industry Minister John Button was given the task of redesigning the industry from the ground up. His 1984 plan, which everyone simply called the Button Plan, became the most consequential industrial policy of the late 20th century in Australia. Button's logic was brutal but coherent. The industry was too fragmented. 5 manufacturers were producing 13 different models for a market that bought only 400,000 new cars a year. Consolidate the models, cut the tariffs gradually, and force the survivors to become globally competitive or die. Over the next 2 decades, tariffs would fall from 57.5% in 1984 to 15% by 2000. They would eventually reach 5% by 2010. The number of locally built models was to shrink from 13 to 6. The weaker players would be allowed to leave. Nissan closed its Clayton plant in 1992. Mitsubishi held on in Adelaide until 2008 before shutting its Tonsley Park factory and walking away. By the late 2000s, only 3 manufacturers remained. Ford, Holden, and Toyota were all losing money on every Australian-built vehicle they sold. The Button Plan had a hidden assumption baked into it, an assumption that nobody quite articulated at the time. The plan assumed that the survivors would eventually become export powerhouses, hold prices down, drive quality up, and Australian-built cars would find buyers in the Middle East, in North America, in Asia. For a while, it almost worked. Holden exported the Commodore to the United States as the Pontiac G8 in 2008. Ford shipped Falcons to South Africa. Toyota's Altona plant in Melbourne became one of the largest exporters of Australian-built Camrys to Saudi Arabia and the broader Gulf region. They sent more than 70,000 vehicles abroad in 2008 alone, but 2 things happened almost simultaneously, and together they were fatal. The first was the global financial crisis, which gutted vehicle demand in the export markets Australia had spent 2 decades cultivating. The second was the rise of the Australian dollar. Between 2009 and 2013, the dollar surged from around 65 US cents to above parity with the American dollar. It peaked near $1.10 in mid-2011. For an industry that exported a significant share of its production, this was a slow-motion catastrophe. Every car built in Altona or Elizabeth or Geelong became roughly 40% more expensive in export markets almost overnight. Toyota's Saudi orders collapsed. Holden's American deal evaporated when General Motors went bankrupt in 2009 and killed the Pontiac brand entirely. A 2014 Productivity Commission report laid out the math in clinical detail. The review of Australia's automotive manufacturing industry, chaired by Commissioner Mike Woods, found that Australian car makers were receiving roughly $30 in government assistance per vehicle sold domestically. They were still losing money on each one. The total value of subsidies provided to the industry between 1997 and 2012 exceeded $30 billion. And despite all of it, the industry was producing fewer than 220,000 vehicles a year by 2012. This was less than half its peak. The Commission's conclusion was unflinching. Without permanent and increasing public subsidy, no manufacturer was going to survive in Australia. By the time anyone in Canberra was ready to confront that reality, the manufacturers had already made up their own minds. Ford went first. In May 2013, Ford Australia Chief Executive Bob Graziano stood in front of a row of cameras at the company's Campbellfield headquarters in Melbourne's north. He announced that the Broadmeadows and Geelong plants would close in October 2016. 1,200 workers would lose their jobs. The Falcon, in continuous production since 1960, would be discontinued. Graziano cited costs that were, in his words, double those of Ford in Europe, nearly 4 times those of Ford in Asia. He took 2 questions and left the room. What no one saw coming was how fast the dominoes would fall after that. 8 months later, in December 2013, Holden's managing director Mike Devereaux flew to Melbourne for what was billed as a routine appearance at the Productivity Commission hearings. The new coalition government, led by Tony Abbott, had spent weeks publicly daring Holden to commit to staying. Treasurer Joe Hawke, in a now infamous parliamentary exchange on December 10, told Holden to come clean about its intentions. The next morning, Devereaux phoned Detroit. General Motors had been quietly preparing for the decision for months. By the afternoon of the 11th of December 2013, Holden announced it would cease all Australian manufacturing by the end of 2017. Nearly 2,900 direct jobs at Elizabeth in South Australia and Port Melbourne in Victoria would disappear. Toyota lasted another 2 months. Max Yasuda, the long-serving president of Toyota Australia, had spent years quietly warning his counterparts at Ford and Holden. None of them could survive if even one of them left. The component supply chain was an ecosystem. Pull out one large customer and the suppliers collapsed. Pull out 2 and the third had no chance. On the 10th of February 2014, Yasuda announced that Toyota would close its Altona plant by the end of 2017. 2,500 more jobs gone. An entire industry condemned in 8 months. The reckoning that followed was both swifter and quieter than anyone expected. The Elizabeth plant in South Australia closed on the 20th of October 2017. Geelong's Ford engine plant had shut in 2016. Toyota's Altona factory built its last Camry on the 3rd of October 2017. By December of that year, Australia was no longer a car manufacturing nation. The component suppliers collapsed in a wave through 2018 and 2019. Around 150 firms employing roughly 30,000 people shut down. Some pivoted to defense contracts. Many simply shut their doors. The South Australian government estimated that the closure of Holden alone would cost the state economy $1.2 billion a year in lost output. The industry did not die because workers were lazy. It did not die because management was incompetent. It did not die because unions were greedy. It died because the country was too small. Australia's domestic market was around 1 million new vehicle sales a year. This was simply not large enough to support 3 full-line manufacturers competing in a globalized industry. Minimum efficient scale required production runs of 200,000 identical vehicles per model. South Korea built 10 times that many cars a year. Thailand, with a smaller GDP per capita but a much larger regional export hub, built 3 times as many. Australia was caught in a structural trap that no level of subsidy could permanently fix. The Australian dollar's surge merely accelerated a decline that was already coded into the industry's DNA. The button plan had bought the industry 30 years, the subsidies bought it 10 more, but the underlying arithmetic was always going to win in the end. Australia was too far from major markets, too small in its own market, too expensive in its labor and energy costs to compete on price. Today, the Elizabeth plant has been partly redeveloped. Some of the buildings now house defense contractors and food processors. Lyell McEwen Hospital expanded nearby. The Geelong engine plant site is being converted into a logistics hub. Altona, the most modern of the 3 facilities, was sold to a property developer in 2018 and is slowly being broken up into industrial lots. The skilled workforce dispersed. The engineers, the tool makers, the production line supervisors scattered. Some went into mining services, some retired. A surprising number ended up in Adelaide working on the Hunter-class frigate program at Osborne Naval Shipyard, the federal government's attempt to replace one form of advanced manufacturing with another. The deeper question the Australian car industry's collapse leaves behind is one the country has still not answered. If 100 years of policy, $30 billion in subsidies, a workforce as skilled as any in the world were not enough to sustain a domestic car industry, what does Australia actually build? The mining boom that ran parallel to the car industry's decline provided a temporary answer. Dig things up, ship them overseas, import the manufactured goods back, but mining employs fewer than 300,000 people directly. Its boom-bust cycles have hollowed out entire regional towns. The submarines and frigates being built in Adelaide are heavily subsidized too. They depend on political decisions made in Canberra rather than market demand. Kim Carr gave a short speech to the workers that October morning in 2017. He told them that the closure was not their failure. It was the failure of a national imagination that had stopped believing manufacturing was worth fighting for. Most of the workers he spoke to that day are still in Adelaide. Some are still bitter. Some have moved on. The red Commodore that rolled off the line that morning was donated to the National Motor Museum at Birdwood in the Adelaide Hills. It now sits behind a velvet rope. When Ben Chifley unveiled the first Holden at Fisherman's Bend in November 1948, he told the crowd something significant. An Australia that could build its own cars was an Australia that could build anything. 69 years later, the country quietly proved him wrong. The pattern at work is not unique to cars. A small domestic market, strong currency, distant export destinations, a political system that subsidizes industries past the point of viability rather than confronting their structural problems. It is the same pattern now playing out in oil refining, in steel, in aluminum smelting, increasingly in pharmaceuticals. Australia keeps choosing to stop making things, then keeps being surprised when the things stop being made. The Whyalla Steelworks on the eastern shore of the Eyre Peninsula in South Australia has been on the edge of collapse for nearly a decade. It is propped up by a British billionaire whose financial empire is currently being investigated by the Serious Fraud Office in London. Its 1,100 workers are watching what happened in Elizabeth and Altona. They are wondering if they are next. They have reason to wonder. In February 2025, the South Australian government placed the Whyalla Steelworks into administration. It cited more than $300 million in unpaid bills to local contractors and the Australian Taxation Office. Premier Peter Malinauskas stood on the steps of Parliament House in Adelaide. He announced a $2.4 billion rescue package jointly funded with the Commonwealth, money that would keep the blast furnace lit while a new buyer was found. The language was familiar. The promises were familiar. The workers in their high-visibility orange vests, gathered outside the administrator's office on Playford Avenue, had heard versions of these speeches before. In 2016, when Arium collapsed. In 2017, when Sanjeev Gupta's GFG alliance arrived with assurances of a green steel revolution powered by hydrogen and solar, the parallels to the car industry are almost too neat. A single dominant employer in a regional town. A globally uncompetitive plant kept alive by political necessity. A foreign owner whose commitments evaporate the moment the subsidies do. And underneath it all, the same quiet question that nobody in Canberra wants to answer directly. At what point does propping something up become more expensive than letting it fall and building something new in its place? The Geelong refinery, owned by Viva Energy, and the Lytton refinery in Brisbane, owned by Ampol, are the last two oil refineries left in Australia. There were 8 inches, 2000. The Kwinana refinery in Western Australia closed in 2021. Altona, the BP refinery just down the road from where the Ford plant used to sit, closed the same year. Each closure was met with a federal subsidy package designed to keep the survivors running. Currently worth around $2.3 billion over a decade. Each closure also meant that Australia became more dependent on imported refined fuel from Singapore, South Korea, and increasingly from refineries in mainland China. During the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic, global shipping seized up. Tankers sat anchored off Singapore for weeks. The Department of Defense quietly commissioned a review of national fuel security. Its findings, partially redacted when released under Freedom of Information laws in 2022, were concerning. Australia held roughly 28 days of diesel reserves. This was well below the 90-day minimum required under International Energy Agency rules the country had signed up to in 1979. The aluminum smelters at Tomago in New South Wales and Portland in Victoria tell a similar story. They are kept running by electricity contracts subsidized to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars per year.